Here's something that sounds backwards. The monk who carries the heaviest weight is the one who suffers the least. That shouldn't make sense. Everything in you wants to reject it. More weight should mean more pain. More burden should mean more exhaustion. That's how it works with your job, your relationships, your bills, your endless list of things you're supposed to be doing right now instead of watching this. But the old teaching says something different. It says the monk who trains with the heaviest stone on his shoulders, walking up the mountain steps at dawn, feels less crushed than the man standing still in his own living room, carrying nothing but his thoughts. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand why your mind feels heavier than any stone ever could, and what to actually do about it. This isn't about muscles. This isn't about pain tolerance. This is about something the old mountain temples understood centuries ago, something almost nobody teaches you today. The difference between weight you choose and weight you carry, without knowing you formally. We're carrying it. You already know the second kind. You've felt it. That tightness behind your eyes at 11 p.m. when you're lying in bed and your body is still, but your mind is running laps. That heaviness in your chest that has no name, no single cause, just there. You didn't choose it. You didn't pick it up on purpose. It just accumulated, day after day, thought after thought, until one morning you woke up and it was already sitting on top of you, before your feet even touched the floor. This is the problem almost everyone carries, and almost nobody names correctly. We think we're tired. We think we're stressed. We think we need a vacation, a new job, a better routine. But most of what's crushing you isn't the events of your life. It's the unexamined weight you've been dragging behind you, without ever putting it down. In the old training halls, a young monk would be given a stone, not a symbolic stone, an actual, physical stone, heavy enough to make his arms shake by the end of the walk. He would carry it up the mountain path every single day, sometimes for years, before he was ever told why. Here's the part people miss. The stone wasn't the punishment. The stone was the point. Think about how strange that actually is. A teacher hands you something heavy and says nothing. No explanation. No promise of what it's building toward. Just, carry this. Most of us would quit after a week. We want the meaning up front. We want to know why we're suffering before we agree to suffer. But the old masters understood something we'd forgotten. That some lessons only make sense after you've lived them, not before. So the young monk carried the stone without knowing why. And in that not knowing, something else was quietly happening. His body was learning the shape of a real burden, because a chosen weight, no matter how heavy, has an edge to it. You know where it starts. You know where it ends. You put it down at the top of the mountain, and it's gone until tomorrow. There's a beginning to the walk and an end to the walk. There's a moment when your shoulders take the weight, and a moment, hours later, when they don't anymore. Even on the hardest days, when the stone felt heavier than it had any right to be, the monk knew this simple truth. It will end. The mountain has a top. The path has a finish. And that knowledge alone made the weight bearable. Because pain with an edge is pain you can survive. Now think about what most of us actually carry. It's not one stone. It's not even close to one stone. It's 100 pebbles we picked up, without ever noticing we'd bent down to grab them. An argument from 6 years ago we never actually resolved. We just stopped talking about it, which isn't the same thing as putting it down. A version of ourselves we're still, even now, quietly trying to prove wrong. The version that failed at something, that embarrassed us, that we've been arguing with in our heads for years without ever winning. A fear about the future we rehearse almost every night, like running through a disaster in advance, will somehow make us more prepared for it, when really, it just means we live through it twice. Once in imagination, and once, maybe, in reality. None of these have a shape. That's the real difference. A stone has edges. You can see where it begins and where it ends. You can measure its weight in your hands. But a grudge doesn't have edges. Guilt doesn't have edges. The vague, low-grade dread you carry about your job, your health, your future. None of that has a shape you could hold up and say, "This is exactly how heavy this is, and this is exactly when it will end." It just accumulates. It piles on top of itself, quietly, invisibly, one pebble at a time, until one day the weight has become so normal, so constant, so woven into the texture of an ordinary Tuesday, that you forget you're carrying anything at all. You just think this is what tired feels like. You think this is just what being an adult is. You stop noticing the weight the same way you stop noticing a smell you'd chance. The doomed you stars. This is why the training in the old halls wasn't really about building physical strength, even though that's what it looked like from the outside. If it were only about strength, they could have used weights in a room, built muscle in a controlled way, made the whole thing efficient. But that's not what the mountain path was for. The mountain path was about teaching the body, and through the body, slowly, patiently, the mind, what a real, finite, chosen burden actually feels like in your hands and on your shoulders. Because once you know that feeling intimately, once your body remembers exactly what it's to carry something with a clear beginning and a clear end, you develop a kind of internal alarm. You start to recognize, almost instinctively, when something in your life has stopped feeling like that. You notice when a weight has gone shapeless. You notice when something you're carrying has no edges left, no end in sight, no moment where you get to set it down at the top of a mountain and walk away lighter. This is also why so many people struggle to explain what's actually wrong when their lives look fine on paper. They have the job, the relationships, the routine, nothing that looks, from the outside, like it should be causing this much exhaustion, but they feel crushed anyway. And when you ask them why, they can't point to one specific stone. They can't say, "This is the thing. This is what's heavy." Because it isn't one thing. It's the 100 pebbles. It's the unresolved conversation from years ago. It's the identity they built around being the strong one, the reliable one, the one who doesn't ask for help, and how heavy that identity has become to maintain. It's the fear, rehearsed nightly, that never actually protects them from anything, only steals sleep from them in advance. None of these show up on paper. None of these have a name you can say out loud at a dinner party, but together, they are heavier than any stone a monk ever carried up any mountain. And here's the deeper trick of it. The reason the old teaching insisted on an actual, physical stone instead of just talking about weight in the abstract. You cannot argue with a physical stone. You cannot convince yourself the stone doesn't exist, or that it's not really that heavy, or that other monks have it worse, so you shouldn't complain. The stone is simply there, undeniable, honest, but shapeless weight lets you lie to yourself constantly. It lets you say, "I'm fine," when you're not. It lets you say, "This doesn't bother me anymore," when it clearly still does, every single night at 11 p.m., when your mind won't stop circling it. Shapeless weight is slippery in a way physical weight never is. And that slipperiness is exactly what makes it so dangerous. You can carry a boulder of buried resentment for 15 years and, if someone asked you directly, still insist you've moved on. Because there's no way to weigh it. No way to hold it up to the light and say, "Look, this is still here. This still hasn't been set down." This is why the practice mattered so much, and why it still matters now, centuries later. Even if you'll never walk an actual mountain path with an actual stone on your back. The point was never really about the stone itself. The point was learning, in your body, what an honest burden feels like, so that you could finally catch yourself carrying dishonest ones, so you could stop mistaking 100 formless pebbles for just being tired, so you could start asking, of everything sitting heavy in you right now, the same simple question the mountain path was always quietly teaching. Does this have an edge? Do I know where it starts and where it ends? Or has it become something I've been carrying so long, so quietly, that I've forgotten it was ever something I picked up in the first place? Why your mind keeps picking things back up. Here's something uncomfortable. Even after you put something down, your mind often goes back for it. You forgive someone, and then 3 days later, you're replaying the exact same conversation, rebuilding the exact same resentment, brick by brick, like you're afraid of losing it. You tell yourself, and maybe even tell them, that it's over, that you've let it go, and then you're lying awake, reconstructing every word they said, adding new insults you didn't even notice the first time, sharpening the whole memory until it cuts just as deep as it did the day it happened. You decide to let go of a mistake you made, some decision or moment you've apologized for, made peace with, moved past. And then, at 2 a.m., your brain drags it back out anyway, replays it in slow motion, just to make sure you still feel bad about it, as if forgetting to suffer over something would be a kind of negligence. Why would the mind do this to itself? Why would it work so hard to undo its own healing? Because for most people, weight has quietly become identity, without them ever agreeing to that trade. If you've carried a grudge for 10 years, some quiet part of you has started to believe that putting it down means the person who hurt you gets away with something, that the grudge itself is a kind of justice, the only justice yours. 10 years, and if you release it, the scale tips back in their favor, unpunished, unaccountable, free, so you keep holding it, not because it helps you, but because some part of you has confused holding on with holding someone responsible, as if your pain were the only leash left on someone who otherwise walked away clean. If you've carried guilt about a choice you made, something similar happens. Some quiet part of you believes that releasing the guilt means admitting the choice didn't matter, and it mattered so much. The stakes were so high, the consequences so real, that letting the guilt go loose feels like betraying how much it mattered in the first place. So you keep the guilt alive, not because it's useful anymore, not because it's teaching you anything new, but because it feels like the only proof left that you took the thing seriously, as if the weight itself were the evidence of your conscience, and setting it down would mean admitting you never really had one. This is the trap almost nobody names out loud. We think we want to be free of these things. We say we want peace. We say we're tired of carrying them. But somewhere underneath that wish, there's a quieter, more stubborn belief that the weight is doing something important, protecting a boundary, honoring a wound, keeping score on someone's behalf, proving to ourselves that we're not the kind of person who just moves on from things that should have mattered. And as long as that belief stays unexamined, no amount of forgiving in words, no amount of deciding out loud that you've let something go, will actually stop your mind from going back for it in the dark. The old teaching doesn't ask you to pretend the weight was never real. That's important, because a lot of advice about letting go quietly implies that the pain wasn't valid in the first place. That if you were just more evolved, more spiritual, more mature, you'd have never felt it this strongly to begin with. The old teaching doesn't do that. It doesn't ask you to minimize what happened or pretend the hurt wasn't real. What it asks instead is a much harder, much more honest question. Are you still carrying this because it serves you, because it's protecting you from something, teaching you something, keeping you safe in some real way, or because you've simply forgotten you're allowed to set it down? Because those are two completely different situations, and most of us have never bothered to figure out which one we're actually in. This is the difference between the monk on the mountain and the man in his living room, standing still, carrying invisible weight without even realizing his hands are still closed around it. The monk knows exactly why he's carrying the stone. He chose it. He can tell you the day he picked it up and the reason he agreed to. There's no confusion in him about whether the weight still serves a purpose. He's the one who assigned it a purpose in the first place, and he knows precisely when that purpose will be complete. The man carrying invisible weight often doesn't even remember picking it up. He doesn't remember the exact moment the resentment started, or the specific day the guilt took root, or when exactly. The fear about the future became a nightly rehearsal instead of an occasional thought. It just accumulated, the way all shapeless weight does, until it became part of the furniture of his mind. So familiar he stopped questioning whether it still needed to be there. And this is why the mind keeps going back for things it claims to have released. Because releasing something out loud, saying the words "I forgive you" or "I've moved on," is not the same as actually examining why you were holding it in the first place. Words are easy. Words cost nothing. But the mind doesn't operate on words. It operates on beliefs, on quiet internal deals it made with itself long ago, deals it never got around to renegotiating. If somewhere inside you still believes that holding on to anger is the only way to hold someone accountable, no sentence you say out loud is going to change that belief. Your mind will keep reaching back into the dark, pulling the resentment back out, sharpening it again, because as far as it's concerned, the job of holding someone accountable is still unfinished, no matter what your mouth has been saying. The way out of this isn't more willpower. It isn't trying harder to not think about it, which almost always backfires, because the more you tell yourself not to think about something, the more your mind treats it as urgent and unfinished. The way out is going underneath the surface decision and actually asking the harder question, honestly. What do I believe this weight is doing for me? What am I afraid will happen if I actually, fully set it down? If the honest answer is nothing, if the weight has truly finished its work, if the lesson has been learned, if the person has already faced whatever consequences life was, going to hand them regardless of whether you kept suffering, then you can finally release it, without your mind sneaking back for it later. But if the honest answer is something more complicated, if some part of you genuinely believes the weight is still protecting you or proving something, then that belief is what actually needs examining, not the weight itself. Because you cannot talk yourself out of carrying something your deeper mind still believes is necessary. You can only understand why it believes that, and gently, patiently, show it that it no longer needs to. The practice of the empty hands. There's an old exercise, simple enough that it sounds almost like nothing when you first hear it described. Before releasing the stone at the top of the mountain, the monk stands still, hands still gripping the weight, and he waits, sometimes for several minutes, sometimes longer, before letting go. At first glance, this looks pointless. He's already carried the stone the whole way up. He's already done the hard part. Why not just set it down immediately and rest? Why stand there, at the very top, still holding something he no longer needs to hold, just for the sake of waiting, not because the waiting made him stronger? That's the part people assume, because we live in a world obsessed with optimization, where every practice has to build some measurable capacity, or it's considered wasted time. But this wasn't about strength. It was about something quieter and, in the long run, far more valuable. It made him aware. It forced him to notice the exact moment his hands were still closed around something he no longer needed to hold. The specific, physical, undeniable sensation of gripping something out of habit long after the reason for gripping it has passed. Think about how rare that awareness actually is in ordinary life. Most of us never get that moment. We go from carrying to carrying to carrying, one burden bleeding into the next, with no pause in act between to notice our hands are still clenched around something we finished dealing with an hour ago, a day ago, a decade ago. We finish an argument, but our jaw stays tight for the rest of the night. We finish a hard year, but our shoulders stay braced for the next disaster, for months after the tough danger has actually passed. We forgive, in words, but our whole body stays on guard, still gripping, still protecting, long after the threat that taught it to grip has disappeared. The habit outlives the reason. That's the part almost nobody catches, because catching it requires exactly what the mountaintop pause was designed to teach. A moment of stillness, specifically built for noticing what your hands are still doing without your permission. The genius of the exercise is that it separates two things we usually collapse into one. There's the moment the burden's purpose is finished. The top of the mountain has been reached. The task is complete. And there's the separate moment when you actually, physically release your grip. Most of us assume these happen automatically, together, at the same time. If the reason for carrying something is gone, surely our hands just open on their own. But that's not how it works. Not for the mind and not for the body. Grip is a habit, and habits do not dissolve the instant their original reason disappears. They linger, they need to be noticed and consciously released, or they simply continue, quietly, indefinitely, long after they've stopped serving any purpose at all. This is why the monk didn't just drop the stone the second he reached the top. He stood there, in the stillness, specifically to feel the gap between finished and released. To notice, my job here is done, and yet my hands are still closed. What is that? Why is that? And in noticing it, really noticing it, not just intellectually acknowledging it, but feeling it physically in his fingers, his forearms, his shoulders, he learned something that no amount of talking about letting go could have taught him. He learned what a habit of holding actually feels like from the inside, separate from any reason that might justify it. Try this honestly, right now, wherever you are. Think of one thing that's been sitting heavy in you lately. It doesn't need to be a huge trauma, some dramatic wound from your past. Just something ordinary, something small enough that you might have dismissed it as not worth examining. A comment someone made a few weeks ago that you still think about more than you'd like to admit. A task you keep avoiding, not because it's hard, but because some part of you has attached more meaning to it than it deserves. A worry about something that hasn't happened yet and might never happen, but that you check in on anyway, almost out of habit. The way you'd check a pocket for keys you already know are there. Now ask yourself, slowly, honestly, without rushing to the comfortable answer, is this still in my hands because I'm using it? Because it's actually serving some purpose, teaching me something, protecting me from a real and present danger, or because I never actually noticed I could open my fingers? Sit with that question longer than feels natural. Most of us want to answer it quickly and move on, because sitting with it honestly means admitting, sometimes, that we've simply been gripping out of habit, for no good reason at all, for longer than we'd like to admit. That question alone, asked sincerely, without rushing past it to feel better, is more powerful than most self-help books you'll ever read, because it doesn't offer you a technique or a 5-step process. It doesn't promise to fix anything. It simply asks you to notice, the way the monk noticed at the top of the mountain, the gap between what's finished and what you're still holding. And once you actually see that gap clearly, once you feel it in your own hands, your own chest, your own mind, releasing it stops being some enormous act of willpower. It becomes as simple and as strange as the moment the monk finally opens his fingers and lets a stone he no longer needs fall quietly to the ground, without ceremony, without apology, and walks on, the weight that was never actually yours. Some of what you carry was never even yours to begin with. Sit with that for a second, because it sounds simple, but it isn't. Most of us assume that if we're carrying something heavy, it must belong to us in some way. We must have earned it, caused it, or at least agreed to it somewhere along the line. But a lot of the weight sitting on your shoulders right now was never yours in the first place. It was handed to you, quietly, without ceremony, by someone else, and you took it without even realizing you had a choice in the matter. The old temples talk about this using a strange phrase, borrowed stones. A borrowed stone is a weight someone else put in your hands. Their anger, their disappointment, their unresolved pain. And somewhere along the way, without any clear moment of agreement, you started calling it yours. You started apologizing for it, as if you were the one who created it, explaining it to other people, defending it, managing it, the way you'd only do for something that actually belonged to you, carrying it like it was your job, your responsibility, to make it lighter, even though you never made it heavy to begin with. Think of the parent who carries disappointment about their own life and hands pieces of it, over years, to their child, Not through cruelty, usually, but through the small daily weight of sighs, comparisons, unspoken expectations. The child grows up and becomes an adult who feels a constant, low hum of not being enough, without ever being able to point to a single moment that caused it. That hum isn't really theirs. It's inherited. It's a stone someone else carried first and passed along, hand to hand, the way you'd pass a bag without asking if the other person had room to hold it. Or think of the friend who is always in crisis, always overwhelmed, always needing you to help carry whatever emotional storm is happening in their life this week. You care about them, so you listen, you show up, you try to help, and that's not wrong in itself. But somewhere along the way, their pain stops being something you're supporting them through and starts being something you're carrying for them. You leave every conversation exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with your own life. You find yourself thinking about their problems in your quiet moments, running through solutions for a situation that was never yours to solve. That heaviness isn't yours. It's borrowed, and it's borrowed so quietly, so gradually, that you never actually agreed to take it on. It simply became normal, the way any weight becomes normal once you've held it long enough. Think about the people in your life who leave you feeling heavier after every conversation, even when nothing was technically said against you. This is worth paying close attention to, because it's easy to miss. Nobody insulted you, nobody blamed you directly, and yet every time you talk to this particular person, you walk away feeling like something has been placed on you that wasn't there before. That heaviness isn't always yours. Sometimes you've simply agreed, without realizing it, to hold something that belongs in someone else's friend's hands. Their bitterness about their own choices, their fear about their own future, their anger at a world that hasn't given them what they think they deserve. They didn't ask you to carry it directly. They just kept setting it down near you, conversation after conversation, until you started picking it up out of habit, the way you'd pick up any object someone kept leaving in your space. This isn't about blame. It's important to be clear about that, because it would be easy to twist this teaching into something bitter, into a way of resenting the people who handed you their weight, or excusing yourself from ever helping anyone again. That's not what this is. Most people who hand you a borrowed stone aren't doing it maliciously. They're doing it the same way it was likely done to them, passed down, generation to generation, relationship to relationship, without anyone ever stopping to ask whether the weight belonged where it was landing. This is about honesty, not blame. You cannot set down a stone you refuse to admit isn't yours to carry, and admitting that takes a kind of clear-eyed honesty most people avoid, because it's uncomfortable to look directly at a relationship and say, some of what I feel around this person isn't my pain, it's theirs. I've just been holding it for them. The hardest part of this practice isn't identifying the borrowed stone once you know what you'd see we were looking for. The hardest part is the guilt that comes with setting it back down. Because once you realize a weight was never yours, there's often an immediate, uncomfortable pull to pick it right back up. A feeling that letting go of someone else's pain means you've abandoned them, that you're being selfish or cold by no longer absorbing what they can't carry themselves. This is one of the oldest traps in caring about other people. We confuse carrying someone's pain for them with actually helping them, but those are two very different things. Carrying it for them doesn't lighten their load in any lasting way. It just delays them from having to face it themselves, while quietly crushing you in the meantime. Real help usually looks like presence, support, honesty, not absorption. You can sit beside someone in their pain without picking the pain up and carrying it home with you. There's a simple, quiet test for figuring out whether a weight is actually yours. Ask yourself, did I create this, or did I inherit it? Is this weight the direct result of something I did, chose, or am responsible for changing? Or is it the residue of someone else's choices, someone else's unresolved history, someone else's fear that they never learned how to carry on their own? This question won't always have an instant, comfortable answer. Some weights are tangled, partly yours, partly borrowed, threaded together so tightly, it takes real, patient honesty to separate one from the other. But even asking the question is often enough to loosen the grip a little, because most people never ask it at all. They simply assume that if something feels heavy in their chest, it must be theirs to solve. And here is the strange relief hidden inside this whole teaching. Once you actually sit with it, if a stone was never yours, you were never actually required to carry it in the first place. You don't need permission to set it down. You don't need the other person's approval, or their understanding, or their agreement that it's fair. A borrowed stone doesn't need a returns process. You simply notice, honestly, that it was never yours, and you let it fall from your hands, the same way you'd set down any object you picked up by mistake, thinking it was something you needed, only to realize later it belonged to someone else the entire time. Silence as the only honest scale. Here's something almost nobody does anymore. Sit in complete silence with nothing to distract you for even 10 minutes, and simply notice what surfaces. Not to fix it, not to solve it, not to turn it into a productivity exercise where you emerge with 3 action items and a clear plan, just to notice. That's the whole instruction, and it's exactly why almost nobody does it. We've been trained, without realizing it, to treat every moment of stillness as wasted time, unless it produces something. So the idea of sitting quietly, with no goal other than noticing, feels, to most people, almost unbearable. Not because silence itself is hard, but because of what tends to show up inside it. Most people avoid silence, because silence is the only honest scale we have. Think about that phrase carefully. A scale doesn't lie. You can tell yourself all day that you're not carrying much weight, that you're doing fine, that things are lighter than they used to be. But a scale doesn't care what you tell yourself. It simply shows you the number. Silence works the same way for your inner life. You can convince yourself, through busyness and distraction, that you're not carrying very much. But the moment everything external goes quiet, the actual weight reveals itself. With no argument, no negotiation, no room for the comfortable stories you've been telling yourself. Noise lets you pretend the weight isn't there. Your phone, your shows, your endless scrolling, all of it works like a second set of hands, holding your burdens for you so you don't have to feel how heavy they actually are. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes something most of us think of as harmless relaxation. Scrolling for an hour before bed doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like winding down. But notice what happens the moment you try to put the phone away and just lie there in the dark with nothing to look at. Often, within minutes, the thoughts you'd been holding at bay all evening come rushing in at once. The conversation you're dreading, the decision you've been avoiding, the low hum of worry you'd successfully drowned out for hours. The phone wasn't relaxing you. It was carrying your weight for you, temporarily, the way a second pair of hands might take some strain off your own. Except the moment those hands let go, the full weight lands on you all at once, usually right when you're trying to fall asleep. This is why silence feels uncomfortable to so many people, almost unbearable in the first few minutes. It's not that silence creates the discomfort, it's that silence simply stops hiding a discomfort that was already there the entire time, quietly, underneath the noise. The moment it goes quiet, everything you've been avoiding walks right up and sits down next to you, uninvited, patient, unwilling to leave, just because you'd rather it didn't show up. That old worry about your finances, that conversation you keep replaying, still unresolved, that formless dread about where your life is heading that you've been managing to avoid by keeping every waking moment filled with something else. None of it disappeared while you were busy. It was simply waiting for the noise to stop. The old masters didn't fear this the way most people do now. They used it, deliberately, as a tool rather than an accident to be avoided. Silence, to them, wasn't empty in the way we tend to think of empty, as a void, an absence, nothing happening. It was the one place where you could finally feel the true weight of what you were carrying, without anything helping you deny it. This is why so many contemplative practices, across so many different traditions, eventually arrive at the same basic instruction. Sit still, be quiet, and pay attention to what comes up. Not because stillness itself is magical, but because stillness removes every excuse you have for not noticing what's actually there. There's a specific kind of courage required for this, one that doesn't get talked about very often. It's not the dramatic courage of facing a crisis or a big decision. It's the quieter, less glamorous courage of sitting with your own mind for 10 uninterrupted minutes, doing absolutely nothing to escape whatever surfaces. Most people, if they're honest, can't make it more than 2 or 3 minutes before reaching for a phone, a task, anything to fill the space. Not because they're weak, but because the culture around them has spent years teaching them that stillness is unproductive, uncomfortable, something to be avoided rather than practiced. If you actually try this, and it's worth trying, not just reading about, you'll likely notice something interesting happen in stages. The first few minutes are usually restless, almost itchy, your mind reaching for something to do. After that, if you stay with it, a kind of settling starts to happen, and the thoughts you'd been avoiding all day begin to surface, one at a time, without the usual noise competing for your attention. This isn't comfortable. It's not supposed to be comfortable. It's supposed to be honest, and that honesty, uncomfortable as it is the entire point. Because you cannot set down a weight you refuse to feel. You cannot release something you've never actually let yourself notice you were carrying. Silence, uncomfortable as it is simply the place where noticing finally becomes possible. It's not about carrying nothing. This matters because it's easy to hear everything said so far and draw the wrong conclusion, that the goal here is some kind of weightless existence, floating through life untouched by responsibility or feeling, carrying nothing at all. That's not it. That's not even possible, and it wouldn't be desirable if it were. Life will always ask something of you. Responsibility is heavy. Love is heavy. Commitment is heavy. Raising a child is heavy. Building something meaningful with your life is heavy. None of that is the problem the old teaching is pointing at. None of that is weight you're being asked to set down. The problem is carrying by accident instead of carrying on purpose. This is the actual distinction the whole teaching has been building toward, quietly, the entire time. There are two completely different kinds of heaviness in a human life, and most people never learn to tell them apart. One kind you choose, with open eyes, understanding exactly what it will cost you and why it's worth it. The other kind simply accumulates around you while you're not paying attention, without your permission, without your awareness, until one day you realize you'd been dragging something for years that you never actually agreed to. When the monk lifts the stone, he knows why. He chose it. He can feel exactly where it starts and where it ends. This is what makes it a burden with dignity, rather than a burden with resentment attached. There's no confusion in him about the purpose of what he's carrying. He isn't wondering, halfway up the mountain, why he agreed to this, or whether it's actually worth it. He decided, clearly, in advance, and every step afterward is simply the natural cost of that decision, not a mystery he has to keep resolving with every breath. Compare that to the way most of us carry the significant things in our lives, our responsibilities, our relationships, our work, often without ever having made a clear, conscious decision about them at all. We drift into obligations. We say yes to things out of guilt or fear, rather than genuine choice, and then spend years quietly, resenting a weight we never actually examined before agreeing to carry it. This is why some people can carry enormous, difficult responsibilities, caring for a sick parent, building a demanding career, raising children through hard years, and feel exhausted but not broken, tired but not resentful. And other people can carry far less, objectively, and feel utterly crushed by it. The difference usually isn't the size of the weight, it's whether they chose it clearly, on purpose, with open eyes. or whether it simply accumulated around them while they were looking the other way. When you carry resentment, you never examined. Guilt, you never questioned. Fear, you never named. That is a burden with no edges, no purpose, and no end date. Notice how different this is from the responsibilities we just described. A chosen responsibility, however heavy, has a shape to it, a reason you can name, a value it serves, sometimes even a natural endpoint in sight. But unexamined resentment doesn't have any of that. It doesn't build toward anything. It doesn't serve a purpose you could clearly articulate if someone asked you directly. It doesn't build you the way a chosen burden does. It just erodes you, slowly, quietly, every single day, wearing you down in ways so gradual you often don't notice until you row. You're already exhausted in a way that doesn't match anything visible in your actual life. This is why two people can appear to be carrying similar loads from the outside and experience them in completely opposite ways on the inside. One person has chosen their weight deliberately, understands exactly why they're carrying it, and finds a strange, quiet strength growing out of that clarity. The other person is carrying an almost identical amount of weight, but accidentally, unconsciously, without ever having examined why, and finds themselves slowly crumbling under something they can't even properly name, let alone explain to anyone else. The goal was never to become weightless. That bears repeating, because it's the part people most often get wrong when they first encounter this kind of teaching. The goal was to only carry what you have actually chosen to carry, deliberately, with full awareness of the cost and the reason behind it, and to release, deliberately, everything else. Not to release all responsibility, not to stop loving people because love is heavy, or stop working hard because effort is heavy, or stop caring about the people in your life because caring inevitably means carrying some of their weight too. The goal is simply to become someone who knows the difference between the two kinds of heaviness, someone who can look honestly at what they're carrying and say, clearly, this one I chose. This one has a purpose. This one is building me even as it strains me. And this other one, the resentment, the guilt I never examined, the fear I've been rehearsing every night for no good reason, this one has no edges, no end, and no purpose left to serve. That clarity alone, learned patiently over time, is what separates a life that feels hard but meaningful from a life that simply feels crushing. There is no ceremony sets the stone down at the top of the mountain. There is no ceremony, no dramatic exhale, no performance of relief. He simply opens his hands, and the stone falls, and he walks away. Think about how much this contradicts the way most of us imagine letting go should feel. We've been shown, over and over, in movies and stories, and even in the way people talk about their own healing, that release is supposed to be dramatic. There's supposed to be a moment, tears maybe, or a long exhale, or some kind of visible turning point where you finally announce to yourself and to the world that you've moved on. We wait for that moment. We think it has to happen before the weight is actually gone. And because it rarely arrives the way we imagine it, a lot of people spend years still carrying things, convinced they haven't really let go, yet simply because the release didn't come with fireworks. But the monk doesn't wait for a feeling. He doesn't need a wave of emotion to wash over him before he's allowed to open his hands. He simply notices that the walk is finished, that the purpose has been served, and he releases the stone, the same way you'd set down a bag of groceries once you'd without applause, without meaning, without needing the moment to feel significant. That's it. No apology to the stone, no guilt for putting it down, no need to explain to anyone why he no longer needs to hold it. The stone doesn't ask for a reason. The mountain doesn't require a farewell speech. He simply opens his hands, and it falls, and he walks on with the rest of his day. This is worth sitting with, because it points at something most people get backwards without realizing it. We tend to think that if letting go of something is easy, if it doesn't come with a big emotional release, If it just quietly happens one day, without fanfare, then maybe we didn't take the original pain seriously enough. As if effortless release is somehow disrespectful to how much something once hurt. So people manufacture difficulty where none is needed. They hold on to old resentments a little longer than necessary, not because the resentment still serves any purpose, but because letting it go too easily would feel, somehow, like admitting it never mattered that much in the first place. This is a strange kind of self-punishment dressed up as loyalty to your own pain, and it's far more common than most people realize. Most of us treat letting go like it requires permission, like we have to justify, to ourselves or to someone else, why we're finally allowed to stop hurting over something. We wait for the other person to apologize first. We wait until we feel like we've suffered enough to have earned the right to feel lighter. We wait for some external validation that our pain was real and significant before we allow ourselves to release it, as if setting it down too soon would somehow prove it was never that serious to begin with. And so people carry things for years past their usefulness, not because they can't let go, but because some quiet part of them believes they haven't yet earned the right to. You don't. That's the whole teaching, stated plainly. The stone doesn't need your explanation. It just needs your open hands. Nobody has to grant you permission to stop hurting. Nobody has to validate that you've suffered long enough. The weight doesn't require a ceremony to be released, any more than it required a ceremony to be picked up in the first place. Most of what you're carrying, you picked up quietly, without announcement, without asking anyone's permission first. It only makes sense that you'd be allowed to put it down the same way, quietly, without announcement, without needing anyone's permission either. There's a specific kind of freedom hidden in this idea, one that's easy to miss the first time you hear it. If letting go required a big emotional moment, a dramatic turning point, a sense of having earned the right to move on, then release would always be complicated, always delayed, always dependent on some external condition being met first. But if release simply requires open hands, a willingness to notice that the walk is finished, and set the thing down, then it becomes available to you at any moment, not just the rare moments when everything aligns perfectly and you happen to feel ready. You don't have to feel ready. You just have to notice that you still gripping something whose purpose has already been served, and choose, deliberately, to open your fingers. This also changes how you think about timing. A lot of people believe there's a right moment for forgiveness, a right moment for releasing guilt, a right moment for letting go of an old identity, or an old wound, and they spend years waiting for that moment to arrive on its own, as if it were something that happens to you, rather than something you choose. But the monk doesn't wait for the mountain to tell him it's time. He simply reaches the top, recognizes that the purpose of the climb is complete, and opens his hands. The moment isn't handed to him. He creates it. The instant he's honest enough to notice the weight no longer serves anything. This doesn't mean every release is instant or painless. Some stones are heavier than others, and some habits of gripping run deeper than a single decision can undo in a single moment. But even then, the shift usually isn't about waiting for some perfect internal readiness. It's about practicing the same simple motion over and over, each time you notice your hands, still closed around something finished. Open them a little further, let a little more of the grip release, without needing the whole thing to resolve in one dramatic gesture. The monk's practice wasn't a single afternoon on a single mountain. It was a repeated motion, done daily, until opening his hands stopped requiring effort at all, and simply became what he did once a weight had finished its purpose. And notice too what's absent from the whole scene. No apology to the stone. This detail matters more than it seems. We often feel we owe something to the things we release. An explanation, an apology, some acknowledgement that we're moving on, as if the pain itself were a person deserving of closure before we're allowed to walk away. But the stone doesn't need anything from you. It was never a person. It was never owed an explanation. It was simply something you carried for a while, for a reason, and now the reason is finished. The apology so many people feel obligated to offer, to their own past, to the version of themselves who suffered, to the memory of what happened, usually isn't for the stone's benefit at all. It's a way of delaying the release a little longer, dressed up as respect. Real respect for what you went through doesn't require you to keep carrying it. It simply requires you to have carried it honestly while it was yours to carry, and to release it honestly once it no longer is. The quiet thunder here is the insight the entire teaching has been walking toward. It's not loud, but once you hear it, you can't unhear it. You were never actually asked to carry everything you're carrying right now. Read that again, slowly, because it's easy to let a sentence like that slide past without actually letting it land. Think about the specific things sitting heavy in you at this exact moment. The grudge you held for years, the guilt over a decision that's long since finished playing out, the fear about a future that hasn't arrived and might never arrive the way you're imagining it. Now ask yourself honestly, who actually asked you to carry these things permanently, every single day, for this long? Nobody did. There was no contract. No authority handed you this weight and told you it was now your job to carry it indefinitely. Somewhere along the way, without a single ceremony, without anyone announcing it, you simply agreed to hold things. Old pain, borrowed guilt, unexamined fear, and you kept agreeing to hold them, silently, every single day, without ever checking whether the agreement still made sense. This is the quiet thunder of the whole teaching, the moment everything it's been building toward finally lands. Most people go through their entire lives assuming the weight they carry is simply a fixed feature of their existence, as fixed and unquestionable as gravity, as unavoidable as weather. They think, this is just how heavy life is. This is just what being an adult means. This is just who I am. Someone who carries this much, because that's apparently my portion. But that's not actually true. And once you see it clearly, you can't quite go back to believing it the same way again. Most of what feels permanent isn't permanent at all. It's simply unexamined. It's a decision made once, long ago, often unconsciously, and then repeated silently every single day since. Not because it still needs to be made, but because nobody ever went back to check whether the original reason still held. The heaviness you feel isn't proof that life is unfair. This matters because a lot of people interpret their exhaustion as evidence that they've been dealt a harder hand than others, that the universe has simply loaded more onto their shoulders than it loads onto everyone else's. And sometimes that's true. Some circumstances really are harder than others. And this isn't about pretending all suffering is equally chosen or equally avoidable, but a significant portion of what feels unbearably heavy in an ordinary life isn't actually a reflection of how unfair that life has been. It's proof that your hands have been closed around things for so long, you forgot they were capable of opening. The weight became so familiar, so constant, so woven into every day, that you stopped remembering there was ever a version of you with open hands, a version of you before this particular stone became a permanent fixture. This is easy to miss because the process happens so gradually. Nobody wakes up one morning and consciously decides, from today onward, I will carry this resentment forever, no matter what. It happens in tiny increments, one more day of not addressing it, one more night of replaying it instead of releasing it, one more year of assuming this is just how things are now. Each individual day, the decision to keep holding on feels almost invisible, barely a decision at all. But those invisible days add up, year after year, until the weight has been there so long it feels like it was never actually a choice, like it was simply handed to you, permanently, without your consent. But it was a choice, every single day, even when it didn't feel like one. And this is actually good news, even though it might not feel like good news at first. Because if it was chosen, even unconsciously, even by default, even simply by never questioning it, then it can be unchosen. It doesn't require a mountain. It doesn't require a physical stone, or a training hall, or years of formal practice. You don't need a mountain. You don't need a stone. You need one honest moment where you actually look at what you're holding and ask if you chose it, or if it simply never occurred to you that you could set it down. That question is available to you right now, in this exact moment, wherever you happen to be. You don't need special conditions to ask it. You don't need silence, or a mountain path, or years of preparation. You simply need to be willing to look, honestly, at whatever is sitting heaviest in you right now, and ask the question the entire teaching has been circling from the very beginning. Is this mine, chosen deliberately, still serving a purpose I can name, or has it simply been sitting in my hands so long that I forgot it was ever something I had the power to release? Most people go their whole lives without ever asking that question seriously, not because the answer is too hard to find, but because it never occurs to them that the question is even available to ask. They assume the weight is just weather, just gravity, just the unquestionable cost of being alive. But it isn't. Somewhere in you right now, there are stones you've been carrying long past the point where they served any purpose, held only by habit, only by the simple fact that nobody, including you, ever stopped to ask whether your hands were still allowed to open. They are. They always were. The only thing that was ever missing was the moment of honesty required to notice it. Coming back to yourself. Remember the monk in the living room, standing still, feeling more crushed than the one climbing the mountain with real weight on his back? That's most of us, most days. Not broken, not weak, just holding things we forgot we were allowed to release. The path forward was never about becoming someone who feels nothing. It was about becoming someone who only carries what they've actually chosen, deliberately, honestly, with open eyes instead of clenched, forgetful hands. You get to decide, starting today, which stones are actually yours, and you get to open your hands around the rest. If this spoke to something in you, subscribe. There's more of this waiting for you.